Okay, this evening I'd like to talk about designing nature reserves, and it'll be based on a lot of my work over the last 20 years in Western North America and Africa. Okay, well, I'll first start with some grim statistics, and hopefully I'll end on a bit more of a positive note. But we're in the midst now of the 6th major extinction event. And the primary causes of species loss worldwide, which factors in this extinction event are first habitat loss, secondly habitat fragmentation, and most recently global climate change. It is estimated that by the end of the century, 50% of the world's species will be committed to extinction. 15 to 37% of the species will be committed to extinction by 2050 as a result of global climate change. And worldwide, is estimated approximately 1 species is becoming extinct every 2 hours. So this is what has kind of inspired me to kind of work in the area that I work in. Now, how are these estimates derived? As a background. Well, one of the oldest principles in ecology is known as the species-area relationship. And this is a relatively simple relationship. There's a positive relationship between number of species and area. And the important thing to note is that the data here are presented on a logarithmic scale. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that you can, if you look at this relationship between area and number of species, if you reduce area by approximately 50%, you lose around 16% of species in that area. Conversely, if you reduce habitat or area by 95%, as shown here, you lose around 52% of the species. So these are how these estimates are derived. Now, combining global climate change models with species-area relationships, these are how scientists predict the number of species that may be endangered by global climate change. So if you look here, this is the, let's assume this is the current range of a species, and this would be the future range of a species, assuming dispersal. And this would be the future range of the species, assuming no dispersal. So you can see that this area is much smaller than this. So once again, this combining species-area relationship with climate change models, this is how they derive these estimates. Well, national parks, game reserves, wildlife refuges are critical in terms of addressing this global extinction crisis. Areas such as Grand Teton National Park, shown here, Grand Canyon, Kilimanjaro National Park, and Tarangire National Park, and both of them in Tanzania, were established not only to protect scenic vistas, but also to conserve species as well as ecological processes. So once again, protected areas are probably the primary mechanism by which we have to kind of address the global extinction crisis. Okay, I think there are probably 5 major issues that need to be addressed if we're to design nature reserves to minimize species loss and maximize species richness. The first relates to the extent of nature reserves. That is, how many nature reserves do we actually need if we are to minimize the loss of species over time? The second critical issue, in my opinion, is location. That is, where should nature reserves be located or established? A third critical issue relates to size. That is, how large should the reserves be? The fourth issue relates to connectivity. That is, how connected should reserves be if we were to maintain species assemblages? And the last one relates to management. Specifically, what are human impacts in their interactions within reserves? and the interactions in relationship to these other factors, particularly size and connectivity. Okay, so what I want to focus on for the rest of this talk are really these four critical issues: location, size, connectivity, and management. Okay, many of these critical issues were addressed more than 30 years ago, and they were presented as a series of geometric reserve design principles. One of the authors was Jared Diamond, and he presented these now more than 30 years ago. Now, these principles generated incredible controversy as well as debate. And in large part, this controversy arose out of this underlying assumption that these principles are based upon, and that is nature reserves over time will become habitat islands. So I think this assumption is valid, and I will be showing a series of slides over the next 40 minutes or so. Some of those figures will illustrate this. Okay, so let's turn to the question, how large should a reserve be? And I want to look at it in terms of large mammals in Western North American parks. These parks are located here in the Colorado Plateau, the Rocky Mountains, and in the Sierra Cascades. But before I show you some of the data on patterns of extinction, this is just to illustrate that indeed many of our protected area parks in Western North America are becoming habitat islands or isolated. What this figure shows is land use immediately adjacent, land use immediately adjacent to Yellowstone National Park. This is a Targhee National Forest, and this is simply extensive clear cutting located immediately adjacent to the western boundary of Yellowstone. Okay, what this figure shows is rates of extinction since park establishment in Western North American parks. And there are really two things that I'd like you to look at. First is that the rate of extinction, shown on this axis, is much higher in small parks than in large parks, okay? But secondly, and most importantly, in relationship to the question of size, how large should reserves be, that if we were to conserve intact large mammal communities in Western North America, you need a reserve of around 12,000 square kilometers over a time period of only 70 to 100 years. That's how old these parks are. Obviously, you need much larger reserves if you want to conserve them over longer time periods, or you need to more intensively manage these parks. Okay, so is this pattern unique to Western North America? So I now want to look at patterns of extinction of large mammals in Tanzanian parks. Tanzania is located in East Africa. It's just south of Kenya. And there's probably been more nature films filmed in Tanzania than any other country in Africa. You have Serengeti and Ngorongoro located here, Kilimanjaro, Tarangire, Ruaha, and Arusha National Parks. Now, these parks in Tanzania are becoming habitat islands, just as many of our parks here in Western North America. What this slide or this figure shows is the land use immediately adjacent to the parks. And what you can notice is parks such as Kilimanjaro, Arusha, Tarangire are almost entirely surrounded now by agricultural land use. Historically, this was pastoral lands, so it's very similar to our rangelands here in the West. So this has changed very rapidly over the last 30, 40 years. So this is what some of the land use actually looks like. This is Arusha National Park. This is, I don't, if any of you have been there, these are the Mamela Lakes. This is subsistence farming located here. People grow primarily corn or maize and beans. This is Kilimanjaro National Park. I happen to live about there for about 4 years when I was working at the College of African Wildlife Management. But here, the principal cause of the insularization of this park is large as well as small-scale agriculture. And here, this is a very famous coffee-growing region. But the park, Kilimanjaro, now is entirely surrounded with the exception of about a 10-kilometer strip on the northwest corner that does link it with Amboseli. Okay, as a result of this dramatic expansion of agricultural and historically pastoral lands, you've had quite a decline over the last 30 years in large mammal populations in East Africa. What this figure shows is the percent decline in large mammal populations across Kenyan rangelands between the 1970s and 1990s. And one thing to notice is that approximately 50% of the large mammal species have declined by at least 50% over a 20-year period. So large mammal populations are disappearing outside of the parks, and the parks themselves are becoming isolated. Okay, so what has been the patterns of extinction in Tanzanian parks since park establishment? Okay, the parks in East Africa are not as old as they are in Western North America. They're between 40 and 80 years old. But once again, there are two things to notice. First of all, you had much higher rates of extinction of large mammals in smaller parks than large parks. But in terms of addressing the question of how large the park should be, if you want to conserve intact historical assemblages of large mammals in East Africa, over a 40 to 80 year period, the critical size is around 20,000 square kilometers. So we're talking, what does 20,000 square kilometers mean? Okay, Yellowstone, Grand Teton combined are 10,000 square kilometers. Okay, so twice the size of Yellowstone and Grand Teton combines. Okay, so human impacts and their interactions. In many places in Africa, commercial poaching or the bushmeat trade is having serious effect on many wildlife populations. Particularly in West and Central Africa. In Tanzania and East Africa, bushmeat trade is less serious. But they use both wire snares, as shown here, as well as firearms. But in places along the western boundary of Serengeti, you can have miles of these wire snares. Okay, what this figure shows, it compares extinction rates of large mammal species in Ghanaian versus Tanzanian parks. In Ghana, the bushmeat trade is extensive, so commercial poaching is a very serious problem. So what this figure shows, it compares rates of extinction in Ghanaian, shown in blue, versus Tanzanian parks. And there's two things to notice here. First of all, the rate of extinction of large mammals in Ghanaian parks is anywhere from 77 to 13 times higher than in Tanzanian parks. And that's, once again, due in large part to the bushmeat trade, or if you combine isolation with commercial poaching, it really has a serious impact on populations. Okay, and then the second thing to notice is that the rate of extinction is much higher in smaller parks than in larger parks, or the proportionate rate of extinction. So in a park of 50 square kilometers, the rate of extinction in Ghanaian parks is 77 times higher than it is in Tanzanian parks, while in a park of 5,000 square kilometers in Ghana, the rate of extinction is 13 times higher than in an equivalent-sized park in Tanzania. So human impacts do have severe effects in terms of large mammal persistence. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to the question of where should we locate nature reserves? Well, in 2000, Norman Myers and several colleagues at Conservation International identified what they termed 25 of the most globally threatened ecosystems or biodiversity hotspots. And 17 of these 25 biodiversity hotspots are located in the tropics, okay? The only biodiversity hotspot that they identified in North America was what they term the California floristic province. Now, what are the characteristics of these biodiversity hotspots? The first one is that they only cover 1.4% of the Earth's land surface. Okay, so a relatively very small proportion of the land surface. Yet these areas, these biodiversity hotspots contain 44% of the vascular plant species, 35% of the amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal species. Okay, once again, in an area of only 1.4% of the Earth's land surface. And each of these hotspots, each of these 25 hotspots, contains at least 0.5% of the world's plant species as endemics. Endemic species are species that are found only at that site. Okay? So these are not only sites important in terms of total number of species, but they're also sites important because they contain species that are only found there. And each hotspot, and the reason it's globally threatened, each hotspot has lost at least 70% of their original primary vegetation. Okay, well, one of these hotspots is in eastern Tanzania and southern Kenya, shown here, and it's the Eastern Arc Mountains. And these are some of the oldest mountains in Africa. Early mountain activity began somewhere around 170 to 250 million years ago. And when most people think of East Africa, they think of savanna ecosystems. But in fact, there are moist tropical forests, but they're very small and they're located on the tops of these mountains. Now, some statistics about the Eastern Arc forests. The original forest cover around 150 years ago was around 23,000 square kilometers. Currently, there's only around 5,700 square kilometers of forest left. And so they've lost around 75% of the original forest cover. Now, in terms of endemism, it turns out that the Eastern Arc Mountains have the highest ratio of endemic plant and vertebrate species per 100 square kilometers of any of the 17 tropical biodiversity hotspots shown here. And the reason, once again, is because of the very small size of the forests. Okay, so you have, once again, 5,000 square kilometers of forests containing over half of all the endemic species in Tanzania found in these forests. In terms of selected taxa in the Eastern Arc Mountains, 23% of all plants are endemic, 82% of all linephid spiders, 39% of butterflies, 63% of all amphibians, 68% of all reptiles are endemic. Okay? Endemism among birds and mammals is much lower. Okay, for the last 20 years, I've been working in two of the Eastern Arc Mountains, the East and West Uzumbaras, shown here. They're located, East Uzumbaras are located 40 kilometers from the Indian Ocean, very close to the Kenyan border. This is a picture of the East Uzumbaras. You have moist tropical forest located up here, and then at the base of the mountains you have arid vegetation. So these are habitat islands surrounded by this arid vegetation. The East Uzumbaras have the highest number of globally threatened bird species of any of the Eastern Arc Mountains, and also has the highest diversity of African violets. I'm sure that some of you must have African violets in your home. Well, the source of the African violet are the Uzumbara Mountains, and they have the highest diversity of African violets of any of the Eastern Arc Mountains. So let me get back to the question, how large, how connected? Well, as I mentioned previously, the eastern Arc Mountains have lost around 75% of the original forest cover, and the primary cause of deforestation is small-scale agricultural development, logging, both commercial as well as manual pit sawing, and in some cases large-scale agricultural development. Much of the forested area, at least in the East Dusan bars where I work, was converted to tea. So I've been following the population dynamics of around 35 understory birds across a series of forest fragments. These birds fall within, or at least about 30 of these species fall within 6 major families, of which only a few that we have here, but sunbirds, which are equivalent of our hummingbird, ecological equivalent, warblers, doves, waxbills, we don't have those, thrushes, and flycatchers. And I've been following the dynamics of these birds across a series of small forest fragments. This is tea that's shown here. So these fragments are true isolates. This is a 30-hectare site, and it's not far from just north of the Amani Nature Reserve. This is one of 2 protected areas in the eastern Arc Mountains. The nature reserve is 83 square kilometers, because this becomes critical in terms of deciding whether or not it's large enough. Okay, we survey birds using mist nets. These are very fine nets that we stretch up to half a kilometer through the forest. All the birds are banded with individual numbers, and standard morphometric measurements are taken. I've been assisted over the last 17 years by these fellows from a village that was adjacent to my camp, and now most of these fellows are much better than I am in terms of handling birds and removing from mist nets. Okay, what are some of the results? Well, first thing to notice is this compares, there's been a faunal collapse or a loss of species in the small fragments outside of the nature reserve, and what this shows is it compares the number of species captured in the fragment versus the number of species captured under equivalent effort in the nature reserve. And what you can notice is that across all these fragments, all the fragments have lost species over the last 70 years. But even within the Amani Nature Reserve, which is 83 years old, over the course of this study, over the last 20 years, I've actually observed 3 species going extinct. One of these was the red-capped forest warbler shown here. And what this, I'm looking at the dynamics of the birds in the East Dusan bars and then on another site in the West Dusan bars. And both in the east, well, in the east they've already gone extinct. In the west, looks like they're declining. But the important thing to know about this bird is that all the species that have disappeared are restricted to primary forest. Okay, so any type of forest disturbance actually adversely affects these species. So a combination of fragmentation with forest disturbance really does adversely affect these populations. Now, one of the other results of the study is that many of these birds have a great difficulty crossing gaps. What this shows is the maximum distance I've recorded species moving between forest fragments over the last 20 years. And of the 33 species shown here, over 70%, the furthest distance I've recorded them moving was less than 200 meters. And of these species, approximately 20% of the total will not cross any gap in the forest. So they're effectively isolated in a forest patch. Now, okay, what this figure shows is the frequency of movement. Okay, for the birds that can move, how far do they actually move? And we've recorded 175 movements of birds between forest fragments, and of those, 75% of all movements are less than 200 meters. So these birds are unlike many of the birds in temperate regions, they simply do not move around, and once you fragment the forest, then they're effectively isolated. Well, okay, so one of the more positive things that come out of these results is that the Tanzanian government has agreed to try to reconnect the 9 major blocks of forest in the East Uzumbaras. And by regenerating the forests in these gaps, and these are what we're calling wildlife corridors, and work is undergoing, there's several NGOs working on this currently, and if we can regenerate these forests in these gaps, then we will be able to create the largest contiguous block of forest in the Eastern Arc Mountains, an area of 450 square kilometers, so dramatically larger than the Imani Nature Reserve shown here. Okay, so what is the impact of reducing connectivity among reserves? Since we've shown in the previous slide that connectivity seems to be fairly important. A natural experiment has actually been occurring around Tarangire National Park in Tanzania, shown here. Over the last 40 years, there's been a dramatic change in land use adjacent to Tarangire National Park. Tarangire National Park has the highest diversity of migratory mammals of any park in the world. It has 9 migratory species. And what this figure shows are the historical migratory routes and how these have changed over the last 40 years as agriculture has developed immediately adjacent to the park. And what you see is that not only have the migratory routes been disrupted, but the magnitude of the migrations have declined. Okay, so between 1988 and 2001, there's been a dramatic decline in a number of migratory species. Hartebeest, oryx, and wildebeest have declined between 88% and 90% over this 13-year period. Okay, so wildebeest went from around 45,000 to less than 7,000 in this 13-year period. But what's also very interesting is that during the same period, zebra, Grant's gazelle, giraffe, eland, and buffalo populations have remained relatively stable. So we're starting a new project. There's a graduate student over there now to actually look at why there's such a dramatic inter-Pacific response of species to the loss of connectivity, because that may give us some clue in terms of how you actually enhance or how you conserve connectivity between protected areas. Okay, so this leads in to the next question. Well, how do we actually enhance connectivity among reserves if connectivity is so important? Well, about 10 years ago, conservationists, I think, developed this incredibly bold strategy for North America. And the principal proponent has been the Wildlands Project. But their idea is to try to reconnect all of the major national parks and wilderness areas, game reserves in North America with a series of massive wildlife corridors. So stretching from Alaska all the way down to Tierra del Fuego in South America. So this really is a bold vision. And I'm sure that these corridors would work on this scale. And the reason is that we know that species have dramatically changed their range over the last 10,000 years. So we know species can disperse over time. But if we do not have the luxury of designing corridors on this scale, then the question becomes, if we designate something as a corridor, will animals actually use it? So I've become incredibly interested in the last 6 years in wildlife trail networks. I took this photograph yesterday in Red Butte Canyon, just above the University of Utah, but it shows very clearly this network of wildlife trails. And the exciting thing, I think, about wildlife trail networks is that they represent actually a history of how animals move through an area. So I'm working in 2 study sites, one in Red Butte Canyon Research Natural Area right above the University of Utah campus. So 10 minutes I can be from my office up here. And I'm working in the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho, right on the Montana-Idaho border, about 30 miles north of Salmon, Idaho. And what we're looking at is we're asking really 2 questions. What are the landscape attributes of wildlife trails? Because they will tell us something about how animals move. So by that we mean slope, aspect, elevation, distance to stream, distance to high-risk predation zones, food availability, cover, and snow depth. And then how do non-landscape features such as the predator community interact with landscape attributes to affect patterns of wildlife movement? So our 2 focal species are mule deer and elk because they create these very distinct wildlife trail networks. The predator community in Red Butte is coyote, mountain lion, and bobcat. Well, in the Bitterroot Mountains, the reason we selected this site is that you have not only these same 3 predators, coyote, mountain lion, bobcat, but you also have gray wolf. So we expect that with the addition of an additional predator, the movement rules will change. So this involves walking wildlife trails, mapping them with a rather fancy GPS, measuring food availability. We've been assisted by Earthwatch volunteers for the last 3 or 4 years, actually counting the number of food items that are in the diet of the deer and elk in these plots, and measuring snow depth. Okay, and then we integrate this data. It's all entered into a geographic information system, GIS database, and then we develop spatial models to predict where these wildlife trails are. And what I like, this is one of our study areas in Utah. The red lines show where the wildlife trails, and the important thing to notice is that these trails are not randomly distributed across a landscape. In fact, the animals are obviously using rules to govern how they move across the landscape. So in the case of Red Butte Canyon, the best predictors of deer and elk movement are openness of habitat and distance to water. Okay. Okay, so to summarize, in terms of the first question, where the location of reserves, where should they be? Well, at least at a global scale, I think we have a much better idea where we should locate nature reserves. They should clearly be focused in these biodiversity hotspots. Regionally, within East Africa, the Eastern Arc Mountains clearly should be a priority for conservation, and within the Eastern Arc Mountains, the Uzumbar Mountains are very important. In terms of size, how large should reserves be? Well, for large mammal communities in Western North America, if we assume minimal management and we use a time horizon of around 70 to 100 years, reserves should be probably larger than 12,000 square kilometers if we want to maintain intact communities. For large mammal communities in East Africa, reserves probably should be larger than 20,000 square kilometers if we want to maintain intact communities. Okay, in relationship to connectivity. For large mammal communities in Western North America and East Africa, and understory bird communities in the Uzumbar, connectivity is clearly critical. And work in Red Butte and in the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho clearly indicate that corridors need to be species specific. That is, you really need to design corridors for the target species that you're interested in. And in terms of management, that is, if you have human impacts, how does that combine with size? Well, for large mammal communities in East Africa, you obviously need much larger reserves than 20,000 square kilometers. And for understory bird communities in the Uzumbar Mountains, you need much larger reserves than probably 83 square kilometers. Okay, so I will stop there and be happy to answer any questions.
Some of those areas together, how long is the recovery period to get it back to a more natural state away from the agriculture in Africa?
Yeah. Well, we're actually, or the people that are working on regenerating the forest between the forest gaps, in the East Uzumbar Mountains are having to learn as they go along because they know that they want to use native species, okay? Just as an aside, you can plant a eucalyptus in the East Uzumbars and harvest it in 7 years. So the growth rates are tremendous for certain species. But for some of these other species, they're much slower growing. And there's been much less work understanding how you regenerate native species. But I think that while these areas are becoming isolated, these species are not going to disappear tomorrow. It's going to be a relatively slow process over several hundred years. So I think we probably have 50 to 100 years. So we can afford to allow the forest to regenerate naturally as long as, the important thing is to get something planted there and then keep people from coming in and cutting it back down again. Yes?
So what do you do with the people in the agricultural, all that's going on that's
Right.
taking over these places? Is there someplace else that they can develop?
Right. Okay, well, let me talk about, around Tarangura, what's happened there is that the traditional land use is pastoralism, and the pastoralists there are the Maasai. But what's happened is that as farmland has become scarce in these highland regions, people have moved into these more marginal areas. Now, the small-scale farming is probably less of a problem than the large-scale commercial farms are growing beans. But I think at this point, the strategy has to be focused on trying to maintain those few areas that still have pastoral land use. It's going to be very difficult, obviously, to convert agricultural land back to pastoral. So I think what various conservation groups are doing is that they're trying to work with the pastoralists in these areas to encourage them to maintain pastoral lifestyles and then try to work with regional and district governments to pass zoning laws that will prevent agricultural development from expanding into these other areas. Yes?
You haven't mentioned anything about the predator management or the management of the species other than just providing habitat for them. There's got to be some relationship to the number of predators and how them animals move and what kind of control there is and so on. Are you working that in with this?
Yeah, okay. Now, the data that I've presented here assumes kind of a hands-off approach to management, okay? So you could probably maintain intact large mammal communities both in Western North America and East Africa in smaller areas than been shown here, okay? And in fact, that's been a philosophy that's been adopted by particularly wildlife managers in Southern Africa. It's a philosophy that has been resisted by wildlife managers in East Africa. And here in North America, you have kind of philosophies that vary according to the management agency. The Park Service is is more reluctant to actively manage wildlife populations, while the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service have adopted a different policy. Yeah.
So what advantage then is there? Well, it would seem to me that the having the connected corridors and an opportunity for the dispersal of wildlife and so on, that would spill over to areas where you do have wildlife management for hunters and so on.
Right. Okay, so immediately, okay, in the case of Tarangara National Park, okay, all these lands outside the park itself are managed as either what are called game control areas or open areas. In these areas, hunting is permitted, okay? And so these are choice areas for hunting when animals do move out, and that is permitted in these areas. Yes?
Another question. You talked about earlier the weather, the climate, you know, and that's obviously part of the problem that was changing.
Mm-hmm.
So in looking at kind of your, looking forward to your plan of, you know, connecting them and trying to build this up again, can you look at a kind of an estimated cycle of weather and then coordinate? I mean, how's that going to affect building up? I mean, would you have a hard time building it up if the weather was,
Yeah.
you know, even if you got these lands?
Yeah, well, this is one of the real fear of conservationists, is that with global climate change, species are going to change. The geographic range of species will change over time, okay? And if they can't change over time, then that's what's going to drive many of these species into extinction, because the optimal range for them may be 200 kilometers to the north, but they no longer can disperse to the north, okay? So then they're restricted to areas that are no longer, you know, meet their requirements. So these are how people are deriving these estimates of species loss based on climate change. And this is the other critical reason for these large corridors, because with the large corridors, then many of these species will be able to naturally disperse over time to areas that are more suitable. Yeah. Yes?
Well, I'm interested. You seem to be supporting the, if you go to the SLOSS acronym,
Yeah.
several large or single large or several small
Yeah.
reserves connected by corridors.
Right.
You know, in California, they seem to be, because it's so developed, they have lots of small reserves. And I'm interested, what level of management do you see in the small ones as well as the large ones? Because now we have wolves that are going out into, you know, the agricultural areas of these farm or ranches, killing. And, you know, in California, we've got mountain lions that can't be hunted anymore in California. They're
Right.
now threatening and already severely threatening some of the bighorn sheep that are also endangered.
Right.
So what level of management?
Well, I think the smaller the reserve, the more intensive the level of management. And in, you know, areas where you have in high human population densities, you know, obviously you will need very intensive management. One of the tragedies, or one of the sad things about the expansion of agricultural development, is that not only do the wildlife suffer, but many of the subsistence farmers suffer, because you have elephants and buffalo that move into at night and can wipe out a year's worth of food in 2 or 3 nights. So this conflict between wildlife and humans becomes more intensified as the boundaries between, you know, protected areas and human communities become smaller.
I think you're recommending fences, big electric fences, barrier fences?
Well, in some areas, yes. You know, you clearly have to prevent animals that can destroy, you know, these subsistent farmers' livelihood in one night. Yeah. Yes.
I appreciate very much what you said about Africa. I spent some time there and know about it. I'm concerned about the management of our wildlife here in the West, and particularly concerned about some of the smaller animals particularly if you want to think in terms of amphibians and reptiles. These animals have a very limited home range. Some of them might live on an area not much more than 3 or 4 square yards in a lifetime. And as you talked, and I thought about the work that's been done here in Utah, Woodbury and Hardy wrote a very nice paper on the desert tortoise in southwestern Utah. There is an area there that could be marked off where they could live rather comfortably, if we want to put it that way, for a long time. But the way it is now, people go into those areas, pick up the desert tortoise and carry it home, or if they get a Gila monster to sell, they do so. And these animals live within a relatively small area. Don't you think, now you've been talking about large preserves. Don't you think there is room in the West here for many of our species to live protected in a smaller preserve where they can survive without a lot of difficulty from whatever else comes along? I don't know. I'm thinking in terms of what we have established in southwestern Utah, the Lytle Preserve. I don't know whether you've been there or not, but it's not large enough, but it's a start. Do you think we need to do more in the way of developing preserves that are smaller, but that are established primarily for the purpose of preserving the smaller animals?
No, I agree with you entirely. I think there's the reason for kind of focusing on, at least the reason why I'm attracted to these species in terms of conservation biology is because if you focus on these, you can conserve many other species. Okay, these are umbrella species, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if you focus on these, you're going to miss many of these other species, such as the one that you're talking about. So I think we need two strategies. We need strategies that focus on kind of conserving entire ecosystems, and then we need strategies that focus on these species that are missing by this other approach. So I fully support the importance of small reserves for protecting threatened species. Yes.
Well, this is a larger species, migratory species, and one of my contentions through the years has been that the predator species is what made these other the prey species wild.
Uh-huh.
If you didn't have sufficient predator species and so on, you would have wild animals without the predators. We've got them all up and down the Jordan River now, deer coming out our ears, and we don't have the predators there, but they're coming, and there's conflicts between the people and they're living in those areas, and they're increasing. But the problem that it seems to me is that you take the wolf, for example. There's a great movement from the sportsmen up in Idaho. They're up in arms over the predation on the elk, for example. But with our hunting regulations in Utah, we've dispersed elk in areas that I never thought we would see elk by the hunting pressure and the type of hunting that we've had. I don't know how all that's going to tie in of what kind of future wildlife management we're going to have as populations increase, hunting decreases, and you get an ecosystem that I don't know whether you can have a large enough area to keep it in balance, where the predators won't be a devastating effect upon some of the species in the area without some kind of management. themselves, they will. If the prey diminishes, the predators are only a couple of years behind. They go in cycles. And I don't know what the future is going to hold, even if we set up the corridors with so many people on the outside encroaching on it.
Right. Well, I think the one thing that we do know is that, I'm sure as you recognize, predators have larger area requirements than herbivores. Okay. So if you design a system around the requirements of the predators, then often that will encompass the requirements of the herbivores, but not always. Okay.
Any more?
One thing, I was interested in your work with the birds in East Africa. And, are you or others looking at the genetic diversity in those populations to see whether
Yeah, I haven't been. Yeah, this fellow in Copenhagen at the National Museum in Denmark that's been looking at genetic diversity in the populations. And there's a fellow in Belgium that's working in the mountain range immediately to the north, looking at genetic diversity within some of the bird populations there. And there was a student from the University of Wyoming that came out this summer with me. And we collected around 300, 400 blood samples. And she may not work on it, but now that we have these samples, that can actually be a great project for a student in the future. But yeah, that should be done. Yeah, so there are a few people, but it's not like North America where you have hundreds of people working on 3 or 4 species. I mean, maybe there's been 2 or 3 people that's worked on one species out of 300 or 400. Yeah. Yes.
I know as I work on large mammals too, and I think that we tend to think that it's top-down driven ecosystem and control. Like if we don't have the wolves, then it's all not going to be in place. And I think it took long-term studies in Isle Royal, for example, to show that when the moose came, the caribou were gone. They were eliminated. Then when the wolves got there, finally we thought, oh, now we've got a balanced system. And it wasn't balanced because weather eventually took over. Then we find out that disease, lumpy jaw, takes over, and that's controlling moose populations. Not only that, the sodium deficiency then governs reproduction. So as you study these more and more of these parts come into focus, and it's very difficult to manage from the a single concept like that. It takes a lot of years to put that together.
Yeah, I guess my only argument is that if you have a large enough area, you don't probably have to understand the system as well. I mean, these systems, if you can protect a large enough area, then you have a large number of degrees of freedom in terms of management, okay? But as the areas shrink, then the management challenges become more pronounced. And I think the case that you give, Isle Royal, what is that? 100 square kilometers or so. It's not a particularly large area. And it becomes increasingly more difficult to maintain the communities there. So that, I think, is the one advantage of large areas, is that it gives you more degrees of freedom in terms of management. But once again, we may not have that luxury. So then I think it's very important to establish these smaller reserves to protect these threatened and endangered species.
In the interest of time, can we do one more question and then kind of officially let go? And anybody who wants to grab Bill's ear can come up here. So, did you have a question?
No, it's okay. I'll ask him after.
Anybody want the last one? I'll ask one.
Okay.
Jim, do we know enough? For every place habitats are fragmented around the world and all those hotspots, we probably don't have the luxury of a 20-year effort like you've put into the African parks or the Eastern Arc Mountains. Do we know enough about birds and mammals and butterflies or whatever the key things are to have any idea of some general rules that might be applied to other systems that where we don't have the time to collect the same database?
Well, okay, one thing we know is that species are not evenly distributed, okay? Now, the question is, do we focus on areas with the greatest number of species? Do we focus on the areas with the greatest number of endemic species? Species are only found there. And if we focus on taxa that are well known, such as birds, do they represent other taxa? Well, unfortunately, they don't, okay? And it turns out that areas that are species rich, these 25 biodiversity hotspots also have high numbers of endemic species. So we have, I think, at least at a global scale, I think we have a pretty good idea where we need to focus our conservation efforts on, okay? But when it gets down to the question, okay, we only have so much money, we only establish so many reserves, where are we going to put them in the Eastern Arc Mountains? And that would be a very difficult question. Well, there's 3 or 4 areas that are very, very important. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to lose other species that may not have as many endemic species, but nonetheless are endemic to that particular area. But I think we know over the last 20 years, I think we've made a lot of progress. One, I think we understand that size is important, particularly under minimal management. We understand where we should locate reserves, at least on a very broad scale. We understand that connectivity is important. I think we have that understanding now. And what appears to be limiting most at this point is really the political will and the money, okay? In terms of global expenses, I've heard some figures around $200–300 billion in order to protect these biodiversity hotspots. Well, that's a fair amount of money, but in terms of maintaining the natural heritage of our planet, that really is not a lot of money, okay? So I think in part it takes political will, but I think we know enough now that if the money were to come along, we could do a pretty good job of saving the majority of the world's species.
Why don't we officially stop now and then